Thank you, everybody.
John?
Thank you, everybody. I think I'm going to go over here to speak. So, my name is Angelo Lopez. I'm the cartoonist for the Philippine News Today. It was formerly the Philippines Today until last week.
Oh.
Last week, about Friday, I found out that the Philippines Today merged with another newspaper, the Philippine News. So now, hopefully, it's a bigger paper. The circulation for the Philippines Today is was around 20,000 people. So with the merger, I think the circulation is a lot bigger. So this picture over here is a self-portrait I did. At around 2006. So if you want to know what my view of the world is, that sort of encapsulates it. A little bit about myself. To the left is a picture of my niece. I have 10 nieces and a nephew. My father was in the Navy for 20 years. My father was in the Navy for 20 years. After he retired from the Navy, he worked as a cook for several years until he quit for good. And then my mom worked very hard as a housewife, raising 3 boys and a girl. So when I joined the Philippines Today in 2011, I actually didn't know very much about the Philippines, and I didn't know very much about Filipino-American culture because I was raised here. So I figured when I joined, I figured this was my opportunity to get to learn more about the Philippines and the Filipino-American community. So can everybody hear me?
No.
Okay.
We can.
I'll try to speak louder. Okay.
You gotta talk
Into
closer.
the
Also, okay.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah,
So to the right,
much better.
okay. To the right is my wife, Lisa. We've been married for 14 years. I've been very happy, and I'm hoping she's been happy too. To give you a sense of my politics, these are some of the heroes who shape my politics. To the left is the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King Jr., the folk singer Pete Seeger, and Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day was a political activist, and she was co-founder of the Catholic Worker. And I admire them because they fought for minorities, for workers, for the poor, and for anybody who's been marginalized. So I like that to be reflected in my own politics. Also, Filipinos, basketball is one of the favorite sports of Filipinos. So I want to give a quick shout out to my favorite team, the Boston Celtics. So I can tell this is a diverse crowd. So my father, he was a fan of the Celtics in the 1960s when they had Bill Russell and Bob Cousy. I started becoming a fan of the Celtics in the 1970s, and I've been a fan ever since. And both my father and I, we've been trying to get my nieces to like the Celtics, but a certain Golden State Warriors team has been hindering in that effort. Okay. So how do I get my ideas? When I first started working on the Philippines Today, the editor suggested that I look up this website, philnews.com. And if you look at philnews.com, they have a list of all the news websites in the Philippines. And so when I first started in 2011, for the first few years, I would just look at that website and then read all the articles. But as time went on, I started having favorite websites. So these are my favorite websites that I look to when I want to learn more about certain issues. Rappler, the Philippines Daily Inquirer, ABS-CBN News, the New York Times, the New Republic, and The Nation. So I also go to protest and political rallies, and I try to talk to Filipino-American activists and ask them, what are the issues that you're dealing with? And when I do that, I go home and then I research into whatever they're talking about to try to learn more about those issues. And I've learned that these Filipino-American activists, since they're in the grassroots, they know more about issues before it hits the mainstream. And so it's a good way for me to learn. And so, how do I do a cartoon? This is what a cartoon I did last week. So, first thing I do is I make a lot of sketches. Then when I get a sketch that I like, I copy the sketch I take my printer and I copy my sketch onto drawing paper. After I do that, I ink the cartoon with India ink and various nibs and brushes. And then after that, I scan the finished cartoon into the computer and I do any editing in Photoshop. So this is what I did last week. So I have a week, I do a weekly cartoon, so a cartoon once a week. So I have until, but I try to finish my cartoons by Friday so that during the weekend I can spend time with my wife and not have anything to worry about. So I do a sketch, and in this sketch I kind of put some little collage in Photoshop. And then when I ink the drawing, but I didn't like the drawing, the finished cartoon, so I redid it since I had a week to go. And so I did another cartoon, I did another sketch, and then I inked that. And then I went in the Photoshop program and I collaged some faces onto the cartoon. So this particular subject is something I only learned about 2 weeks ago in a Washington Post article. And in that article I found out that YouTube, Facebook, Google, they've been hiring people from the Philippines to take away any offensive content from their media sites. But the Washington Post found that a lot of these Filipino content moderators have been getting mental health issues because for 6 hours a day they've been seeing the worst in the internet and stuff. So I did that. So I'm probably going to learn more about it as it goes along, but I just found out about it 2 weeks ago. Okay, so the first subject that I work on in my cartoons is the plight of overseas Filipino workers. The Philippines economy has been growing a lot in the past few years, but the poverty rate in the Philippines is still 21%. So a lot of poor Filipinos have to go overseas for economic opportunity. And then when they're at foreign countries, they send the money back home to support their families. There are a few problems with this. One of the problems is that these workers in foreign countries have to they spend so much time working in those countries. They oftentimes, there's a long period of time where they don't see their families in the Philippines. So sometimes it's months, sometimes it's even years. So that this causes a lot of emotional trauma in the family. Another issue that overseas Filipino workers face is that a lot of these overseas Filipino workers are not covered by the labor laws in the countries in which they work. So that means that many countries their labor laws do not cover migrant workers. So that means that these Filipino workers are often very vulnerable to exploitation. And one of the things that they're vulnerable to is sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Another thing that overseas Filipino workers are vulnerable to is wage theft. Wage theft means the employer doesn't pay the worker what they're due. So, especially domestic workers and caregivers are especially vulnerable to wage theft. So we have a system where these overseas Filipino workers are contributing a lot to the Philippine economy, but the Philippine economy doesn't give them opportunities to stay home. They have to go overseas for work. So according to the Nikkei Asian Review, overseas Filipino workers send $28.9 billion back to the Philippine economy, which is 1/10 of the Philippines' gross national product. But according to the Philippine Statistics Authority, 21% of Filipinos still live below the poverty line. So even though these workers are contributing a lot to the economy still has a very high poverty rate. Another thing that I focus on in my cartoons is the struggle of indigenous workers in the Philippines. One of the issues, one of the reasons why these indigenous people have so many problems is that the land that they live in is rich with natural resources. So multinational corporations have been trying to drive out these indigenous people from their lands so that they can get to their, so they can mine these natural resources. Oplan Bayanahan, it's a paramilitary group. They're supposed to be focused on communist insurgency in the Mindanao area, but what's happening is that these multinational corporations are instead using these troops to attack anybody who defends the right of indigenous people. So human rights activists, environmental activists, human rights lawyers, journalists, priests, nuns have all gotten killed by these paramilitary groups for speaking out for the rights of indigenous people. And one of the indigenous groups that are most facing attack is the Lumad people. It's in Mindanao. The Lumad people, they value highly education because they see education as a means where they can defend themselves from encroaching mining companies. So it's not in the interest of these mining companies to have these Lumad people educated. So in the past few years, paramilitary forces have been targeting Lumad schools and Lumad teachers. So, they've been driving a lot of these Lumad people into camps that are 100 miles away from their original home. So, yeah, I apologize. These are not funny cartoons. So, another not so humorous subject, I guess, is in the Philippines is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. So, I've been focusing a lot of my cartoons on that as well. So, Philippine journalists have gotten killed for investigating mining companies, for investigating government corruption, for investigating political families, because political families have a large power in the Philippines, for investigating crime, criminal gangs, and criminal syndicates, and also for investigating extrajudicial killings. Since 2016, there's been a large online army of trolls who support the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, and they've been harassing anyone who posts articles on the internet that are critical of the Duterte government. And so women journalists have been threatened with rape, and both male and female journalists have been threatened with their lives, and their families have also been threatened. These online trolls have had a chilling effect on dissenting views on the internet in the Philippines. A group that's been especially a target of the government harassment has been a news media site called Rappler. Rappler is like it's like ABC, CBS, or 2020. It's sort of like a Philippines version of that. So the past 14 months, the government has tried 11 times to levy charges against Rappler to get it to stop publishing articles critical of the government. And one of the co-founders of Rappler, Maria Ressa, has recently been arrested and is now on trial for tax evasion and libel. And this is not something that's uncommon among critics of the Duterte government. Many of the critics of the Duterte government have been charged with crimes and stuff and been put in trial so that they can be silenced from speaking out against the government. So the International Federation of Journalists has rated the Philippines the most dangerous country in Southeast Asia for journalists for the year 2018. 12 journalists have been killed since Duterte came to power in 2016. So as you can tell, I am not a fan of extrajudicial killings. So I can define extrajudicial killings as the Duterte government is giving the police impunity to kill people who are suspected of drug crimes without giving them a chance of defending themselves in a court of law. And what's worse, Duterte's told civilians that if the police aren't present, you can shoot and kill these people yourselves. And so a lot of people have been getting killed. I do think there is a drug problem in the Philippines, but I don't think allowing police to kill people who are only suspected of a crime is as a way of fighting drugs in the Philippines. So
the D30, what's that?
D3, that means Duterte. That's like a shortcut.
Okay.
Duterte. D30, I guess, Duterte. So yeah, I didn't learn about that until recently too. So yeah, but so it's there's no accountability for these police and for these vigilantes who are killing all these people and stuff. So even though I am against extrajudicial killings, I'm a pretty minority opinion. A lot of Filipinos right now support Duterte. His popularity is in the has consistently polled in the high 70s or the low 80s. So one of the reasons I put these cartoons towards the end of my presentation is if there's anyone who disagrees with me, or if anything happens to me pretty soon, at least you got a chance to see my earlier cartoons. So.
Okay, maybe that wasn't funny to laugh about.
It's okay, I've learned to duck. So, I'm kind of lucky because since I live in America, I haven't faced any harassment, but a lot of cartoonists and newspaper people in the Philippines have and stuff. So, yeah, feel free to criticize me if you want. I'm pretty safe. So, but as well as people getting killed for drug crimes, critics of extrajudicial killings have also been harassed and sometimes assassinated by the government. So the journalists, leftists, the Catholic Church, and indigenous rights activists have all either been harassed or in some cases killed for speaking out against the government policy of extrajudicial killings. So, according to a Human Rights Watch World Report, the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency reported 4,948 people killed during 2016 to 2018. And according to the Philippine National Police, vigilantes have killed 22,983 drug suspects. None of these people who have been killed have ever been put in a court of law. They've just been shot. So the ones that have been killed, the vigilantes, the police classifies it as homicides under investigation. So, as well as issues in the Philippines, I also do issues in the American political scene. And one of the issues I'm most concerned about is how do you bridge the racial divide? And how do you bridge the racial divide between the working class white communities that support Donald Trump and the minority communities that feel threatened by Trump? I think it's important to try to bridge that divide because I think both communities, when they're stuck in a little silo, they tend to think the worst stereotypes of the other side. So I think it's important for both white and minority communities to reach out to each other. You know, for the working class white communities, especially in the Rust Belt, they've been struggling. A lot of the jobs that used to provide them with a middle class way of living have been outsourced. And the jobs that remain pay half as much as the jobs that got outsourced. And so a lot of young people in these communities have been leaving for the cities for better economic opportunities. And because of economic distress, there's a huge, a terrible opioid crisis. So we do need to reach out to them and help them. So I think I think minority communities can help reach out and maybe steer some vulnerable members of these white communities away from like white nationalism or the alt-right. The sort of racism that we're seeing today, it's nothing new. In American history, we've seen this sort of different groups get targeted for prejudice. African Americans were targeted, slavery and Jim Crow, the LGBTQ community. In the 1800s, the Irish, the Chinese, Mormons, Catholics. In World War I, it was German Americans. In World War II, it was Japanese Americans. And for Filipinos, we faced a special discrimination in the 20s and 30s when we were working in the fisheries, in the agriculture fields in Alaska, Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington. So all of these different groups are facing the same sort of targeting that Muslims and immigrants are facing today. So this cartoon was inspired by my brother-in-law. He's an anti-Trump conservative. So even though my politics is very different than my brother-in-law, we get along very well. But in 2016, we really bonded because we spent the entire year griping about Trump. In my opinion, I think moderate and conservative Republicans need to fight with the white nationalists and the alt-right who are trying to have a better influence in the Republican Party. Because, if they don't, I think I see the problems that we're going through in this country getting worse. So here are some of examples of Republicans within the Republican Party who are fighting the prejudice within their party. So on the upper left is Margaret Chase Smith. In the 1950s, I think she was a Republican from Maine. In the 1950s, she spoke out against fellow Republican Joe McCarthy, and she denounced Joe McCarthy's red baiting tactics. On the upper right is William F. Buckley. William F. Buckley was a conservative intellectual who founded the National Review magazine, and he spoke out against the John Birch Society. Buckley felt that the John Birch Society's racism and conspiracy theories would be a terrible influence on the conservative movement. And for the same reason, Buckley opposed the George Wallace presidential campaign of 1968 and the Pat Buchanan presidential campaign of 1992. On the lower, is that right? At the lower left is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a famous baseball player who integrated baseball with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Jackie Robinson was a Republican, I think, most of his life. And in 1968, Jackie Robinson joined other black Republicans in opposing Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. the Southern strategy was how do you best describe it? It was a sort of tactic to try to use coded racist appeals. He was trying to attract Southern white Democrats who did not like Lyndon Johnson's civil rights legislation. And the person on the lower right is Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a conservative senator from Arizona. In the 1980s, Barry Goldwater confronted Jerry Falwell in the moral majority. He felt that the Goldwater felt that the moral majority was a grave threat to the separation of church and state. So this is my last cartoon, and it's in keeping with the theme of trying to bridge the divide between white and minority communities. So how do you reach out to white communities that are struggling while still defending minority communities from racism and bigotry? I posed the question, but I don't have the answer to the question. I have no idea how to bridge that divide. But I hope through my cartoons, maybe it'll inspire somebody who can maybe knows how to, maybe they're smarter than I am and stuff. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to answer any questions. I hope I'll be able to answer questions and stuff to the best that I can. So yeah.
Do your cartoons get published in the Philippines?
I really don't know. I think I know they get published in the San Francisco Bay Area. If you want to see those, the news, it's the Philippine News Today. Go to any Asian American supermarket or any Filipino market, and you can probably see it there. Because we merge and stuff, I'm not exactly sure, how that affects the circulation, but I'm hoping that more people get to see it.
But it doesn't circulate in the Philippines?
As far as I know, no and stuff, but I could be wrong. And stuff. I'm still